The slow movement of this Beethoven's Concerto number 1, which visually is so, but originally, chronologically, was number 2. That doesn't matter really to us after all these years, but it's a fact. Is a Largo, which is slower than Adagio, which is already at ease according to Italian original 2 words, at ease, compared to an Andante, which is walking or pacing, perhaps leisurely through a park and smelling every second rose. And so inevitably there is a fact of subdivision of the pulse that brings us to think that we have to play the extents of the length of sound on the piano's capacity of delayed decay compared to Beethoven's fortepiano's early days, as well as the meaning beyond the quality of the sound of the words in music spoken after a long value, and then pick it at the level of drop at the decay. And re-rise it to go to the next, and sometimes not diminish the punctuation in order to bring the attention span to a further horizon arrival point. Like you can do and diminish, interrupt to the dominant and restart, and then crescendo, or choose to bridge by not diminishing. This way the BG becomes a question, isn't it? And use the rest that Beethoven indicated rhythmically as a diminuendo of that G before the next E, and obtain and pick up at level. And if you drop and you make a beautiful ending of this first punctuation, you have to start even softer within the key. Mezza voce, mezzo voce, middle voice, low voice, intimate voice, whispered confession, avowal, something close to the intensity of truth being said with infinite depth and profound lightness. Finger legato singing from inside the keys. When the orchestra in the tutti has this conclusive and then connecting to next section sort of ending of sections, like opera acts, and then bringing to the development. Obviously, one cannot play all the parts at once unless one takes off half of each. And normally the playing on 2 pianos with the orchestra part reduced to the second piano gives a sense of 3D depth of sound than to do it on the same piano. Of course it needs an orchestra piano performer. But for today's example, what I want to convey is that the luminous and deeply solar shining, unquestioning mood of this opening. In the same key as the opening of his Sonata Opus 110 later in his life. Or in his Appassionata, more chorale, or in the Pathétique, here, I find that very true, that when one searches to play introspective, deep, and slow, one ends up syllabic recitation or even spelling bee by the letter. I-L-O-V-E-Y-O-U. That's so stretched that you lose the point. And if you only want sounds and not meaning in terms of thematic material that imposes itself as a motivic suggestion for the listener as a GPS to say, this is my theme, remember it, it will come back, you'll recognize it, it's familiar, even if you don't know the piece before, sort of an embedded GPS within the form of the sonata, for the listener to follow, repetitivity being part of it. But if you just do sound for sound, you can do the beginning of Debussy's Reflets dans l'eau, the Reflections in the Water from Image Book 1. Of course, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a theme. It has a three-note echo cell that will repeat it, sometimes cloned, but in any case not developed in the sense of a group of 4 bars like here. First Viennese school. And of course you can argue different pianos have different sounds. The very opening of this played on this piano speaking differently in its voicing, asks for a different phrasing from the pianist. I find that the piano talks to me and I answer to it in order to be a real horseman and a horse combination in harmony, moving forward into the phrasing so that we can express for the audience. Industrial these instruments are compared to violins that are really hand carved. These are handmade, but it has a lot of industrial duplication of the instruments to do with, and you might think that one could think that the sound will be relatively similar, but it's not. And the reason is how you touch it. Toccare, from toccata, touch. almost like a different timbre. It's like playing the oboe and the clarinet in an imaginary way. But to go back to the idea of colors and sounds in terms of timbre colors, if you play something that is not thematical but just based on the resonances and a sensorial expression of sound combinations, like in Debussy, the three notes of thematic motivic material just appear more embedded than brought out here by the texture and as well as by the range. And the same Debussy on this piano. So you could say that if you play the Beethoven opening with a more matter-of-fact, factual sound, because it's thematical, and after that colorized in a certain sound color of the soundscape, you could play it more recitativo-like. Rather than the more daydreamy and more pedal nested. So the legato singing, connected, resonant. If I play the two opportunities that I just had to play on this piano, a little less pedaled and a little more pedaled would be. Or in the more resonant, warmer. Naturally, I use the unicorda between the two, to be honest, in the comparison. What I find very difficult to convey to a student is that beyond the individual sound quality you have to chase from the inner ear outside, what you've read, heard, and how you want its intention to become a reality when you project to the audience in, of course, the ratio of acoustics and architecture of the building where you play, and the instrument on which you play, which you can more or less control. Beethoven C or de Beethoven. But it is true that one needs to be able to colorize imaginatively the texture that is given to play. Of course, in an aria imitation of the opera on the piano, you have to anyway take into account the length of sound. We don't have often the opportunity to choose, let less compare the pianos. We only play the piano that is there. and we study how to make sure that most of our intentions translate through this improbable, ephemeral encounter between an audience, a piano and a pianist, perhaps an orchestra as well, and serving the muse with the quality of one's search for truth, which doesn't exist as one, but as ever changing or achieving temporarily one for the day, the evening, or the performance moment, dealing with the unexpected on stage, as if it was planned. And in between practicing to organize the way we want the sounds to connect into meaningful words through syllables, into sentences with breaks or breaths or both, in terms of their punctuation, which would be the cadences in music. And also take into account the orchestration, where the string players, German Klangteppich, organize a sound carpet for the pianists in terms of soloist imitating the orchestra's oboe, or perhaps a singer. And unlike other concerti for different instruments which already exist in the orchestra, the piano concerto is the one of the only genres where in the orchestration usually you're the only pianist. And if you're a violinist and playing a violin concerto, of course you have a sea of violinists with you who are in the orchestra, etc. So I think that it creates feeling that, because also of the power and the size of the piano, you can rival the tutti or imitate the soprano aria, while the orchestra can give you a warm hugging nest for your sound to blossom into phrases and melodies and whatever the piece calls for. And when you practice the concerto, though, there's a problem, is that most of the time you're alone in a practice room or at home or with an upright piano, and you use the pedaling more as a comforting, because it's so dry and so unappealing compared to the MP3 you hear in your ears when you want to hear how it really sounds before you have a chance to play with the orchestra. Sort of an arranged marriage, because you just play with the orchestra at the altar of the marriage, be it arranged, which is the rehearsal or two and then the performance. So all this preparation towards it, it's in loneliness, where you imagine the orchestra but you hear it inside you, and the pedaling should be much less than in a sonata, since the orchestration, when they play this under the alto or soprano, it already brings that warmth of sound because of the strings, non-percussive, smooth sound, projection, production, connection, warmth, compared to a piano that plays more the, even with pedal, a bit more wet, but still you hear the moment of pop, pop, pop. Ideally, if you play inside the keys in the accompaniment part, you only hear the wah, wah. It allows for a natural bringing out of the melodic line without to force the resonance sound or dynamics levels or volume and such. Whenever, when you practice alone and you don't have the orchestra playing, you get used to practice with the pedal. So at first it's not very useful, because you need to practice the melodic singing parts, even if it's arpeggiated formula, just of course a chord, but nevertheless is melodically used here, like in the Appassionata or the first sonata. It's staccato, but still arpeggiated thematic melodic material. And and then the semitones for the decorative conclusion after this tension build. So you have to play under the E flat, the first D, then inside the E repeated, the key, so it doesn't sound E-E, but E-he. And then tone that tight. Pretty trill, more than a trill, rather a mordent, or less than a trill, but more than a mordent, an extended mordent, which sort of acts as a vibrato of the singer, rather than an embellishment, like Bach, first partita. I know of many composers who trills Chopin the same, even in his Barcarolle, but keep in mind, between Bach's death and Chopin's death is only 99 years, during which we had first Viennese school, open door to Romanticism in the European Age of Enlightenment tradition of literature and socio-economic situation, opening to resonant sounds with the instruments that project more, that speak by themselves rather than as accompaniments of others. Outside of the church music being the only action in Bach's time of music, rarely outside of it. So the secular, concertizing, chamber musicking, music lovers, circles, social ways of interacting music with life for a waltz, be it not danceable, rather with pedal. Chopin's waltz, stylized and not danced. All these aspects are part of the seduction that an artist on stage has with the piano to play for the audience, and with the orchestra for the audience. Meanwhile, one should not seduce without love, as Shebak used to say. And I think that it meant to say that you have to put, Boulanger, my teacher used to quote Shakespeare for that, words without thought never to heaven go. So if you put a meaning to what this means, is this examples of simple openings of musical phrases on the piano by early Viennese school, and then Chopin, of course, for the waltz, speak a lot about the eloquence of the discourse and the fact that it doesn't need a complex and strikingly surprising chromatic harmony in order to have this melodic, emotional, direct trigger to the psyche of the audience through the composer's notation, obviously, from which we read what we want to see in it or miss what we didn't see in it in order to project it in the hearing for the audience. And tempo can change a lot. If you play the opening andante, the meaning is more obvious because the arrival point is more close distant. So you can say something like reading the phone book artistically, or saying something banal as I'm going to go buy the newspaper and come back, without sounding, I am going to buy the newspaper. Sometimes the problem with slower tempi is that they are not as natural for the phrasing direction, arrival point, because we get caught in all the beauties, or sometimes as well the details of the beauties, so the micro overtakes the macro. So if we do the same in a very slow stretch tempo, conductors have to subdivide because you have 16 violins or so in the string section to play together. Here you're alone, you don't have to conduct yourself. It's kind of silly, even if you can count it inside your head. To keep that lake surface calm feeling. And try to see if you can play the same slow movement, largo, less largo, but still as calm. The problem is that if the piano and your fingers get to surprise you with an unexpected bump on the road, like let's say, then it becomes hectic because it's fast. And if you play the same unexpected accents that can occur in a slower tempo, have more time to prepare your touch for the next note, granted, it's syllabically pronounced, but you can maintain the general mezza voce sound of intimacy, mit innerer Ausdruck, as the Schumann writes often, with inner expression, meaning within yourself. You look at the audience with depth of eyes because you think of something that you don't fully or not at all share with them in words. Just by the look in your eyes, they can understand if it's a drama, a daydream, a hope, like in silent film actors. And then when you put the words in the silent film, no more, but spoken film, it's like the music becomes incarnated in this melodic line on this piano today, in this situation, with this acoustic, with that lack of orchestra. And if we try to compensate with too much pedal because we are in a dry acoustic and we're alone, we don't really prepare it for the orchestra. Wouldn't it be nice to have an orchestra full-time to practice the concerto as you learn it progressively? Every week an hour or something to get to know how you dosage the tips of your fingers' pressure in order to obtain that intimacy legato, but projecting as a soloist, which is artificial, like art is artifice, while maintaining that sense of reflection. And probably that's the reason for which the Largo is slower than the Adagio, as I said earlier in this gathering. Because it gives a sense of gravitas, a sense of settling. It starts with the first chord, beat on the 10th open melody instead of on the tonic open closed melody. But still, it's the tonic on the downbeat. In a way, could be the last chord as well as happens to be the first. And then the story goes into the dominant. But in the original chord, you create as well the atmosphere of the background of the painting, as well as you give highlighting for the melodic line of the soloist storytelling. So it's sort of a chord for two purposes: mood setting, meaningful setting. And then the orchestra lets you play alone as a soloist, this more intimate moment in the middle of the range. Whenever just later you'll play the aria, extending the range in the up, the top, and the basses in the orchestra. We have at least 4 octaves span with a double bass's depth, and the piano at the flute soprano level of expression exponentially expanding, when in the original opening it was centered, as if to hug. Like the Arpeggione Sonata by Schubert opening. It sort of like starts with the end, because it's already concluded in the first bar. And then opening the storytelling in here. And the rests that are in between the subsections, as Beethoven wrote it, even in the solo part, playing alone without the orchestra, you have and when you restart, there is an 8th note rest. There's a human breathing when you sing. And the leap of the 6th is the expression of love, just like the example in the Romantic era Chopin, or Wagner's love, death, eros thanatos in Greek, intense opera, Tristan and Isolde. So the ascending 6 becomes major. More dramatic than in the elegant leap of 6th in Chopin, or in a Bach aria from one of the Passions, imploring after Mary observes her son on the cross. So taken alone, that gesture of the ascending 6th melodically is the symbolism of tender love, expression of sorrow sometimes, but because it's ascending, it's less mournful or less lamenting, rather something elevating the spirit, hugging as an appoggiatura the perfect 5th. Bach has an organ C minor prelude that uses 2 voices in dialogue in the upper 2 manuals of the organ, while the pedal of the organ holds this ostinado do, on the note do. Even 3 parts. So this melodic gesture is universal beyond stylistic boundaries of the tonal system span from Bach to Ravel roughly, or even before Bach, and to some composers after Ravel as well. But within this expression that if you play an ascending sixth, you implement something intensely emotional at some degree of intensity, even if it's in major or minor. Of course, it cannot function in atonality where there is no tonic, there is no dominant, there is no hierarchy, so it's different. You just hear sounds which are beautifully connected by the intellect, but don't immediately speak to our psyche unless we learn the piece to know it first. It's like learning a foreign language in order to read the poem in that language. But of course, the classical, so-called classical, tonal music is a grammar word, I guess, the grammar of music. Being tonal, then it's universal. If you hear the opening of Schubert, starting on the first degree, and you hear starting on the first degree, you have some similarity, not so direct because major, minor, different keys, different genres, but when you have the ascending sixth in Bach, might be more religious uplifting, and in Chopin more elegance for dancing. But it does have a universality within its specificity. Cocteau used to say, you're never more international than by being national, true to yourself, if you know who you are, or who you could become. But the melodic lines, often the leaps used in the music of the Baroque or the classical into the Romantic era, I think they express a lot the meaning of the mood in which you want to express your storytelling as a composer. Some people speculate the tonality choices too. I'm not so convinced because they didn't have unified tuning in terms of pitch, A at 4/14, as it is the case for more than a century almost to today. But in fact, when they wrote pieces in given keys, they were not performed in this very pitch every time because the tunings varied. Instrumentally or aesthetically. So there was a relativity to that perfect pitch that I'm sure the composers who composed might have had, but then we associate the tonalities to it. So C minor more the dramatico because of the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven, and F major more bucolic, what's the word in English? More countryside, like the Pastoral Symphony by Beethoven. Compared to and I think that we get so adjusted now to feel undivisibly the melody, the harmony, the tuning all in one. So it would be a blasphemous thing to play in a wrong tonality a piece, because you can argue that the intervals being the same, you have the same intervals, then the singers do when they have a problem with the range for a specific note. So they transpose to fit their voice range. But when you have all these 88 keys tuned in 440 for the A, as an example, then what happens is that you get adjusted to think that it cannot be but in this key. Even if you don't have a perfect pitch, you get used to hear it. And then it's very difficult, especially if you have perfect pitch, to hear it in another key, because it somehow appears dyslexic almost. So I think it's true that we associate in our subconscious a tonality with a piece, and we cannot separate that. even if I play in the original keys. And I might say, but I like it to be more bright, more driven, more rising. Like Scriabin according to synesthesia is the attributed colors that he attributed to the tonalities, given what a concerto for color piano that changes with the tonalities in which you play, to associate more senses than just the listening, daydreaming, imaginary inner life. Also colors. I still believe that all this is in the eye of the beholder, if I may say, for colors. Sorry for the pun. Again, I indulge in improvising as an extension of this early romantic mood of the Beethoven's middle 19th century. Almost like as if revisiting the garden, but alleys he didn't highlight for us that could have been but are not. And won't be in the performance, but it helps to free oneself from the boundaries of the exact note that you have to chase all the time through the best fingering articulation position. But also, in order to appreciate even more the chosen note by the composer, find variations but in little details you dress it differently, and then when you play the very design that he chose for this decorative helm met to the cadence, you grow to appreciate more what he wrote while practicing what he didn't. It's a little bit of a perhaps not conventional way, but a very freeing experience that allows us to focus even more freshly, with more intensity, to whatever truth is vehicled, or beauty, if not truth, embedded by the composer in a given melodic line, which finds are not our own, but our own has to be clear, transparency, to let the music speak, the piano express itself, and just listen to it while playing as a listener plus with fellow auditors. Even the silences are by the composer. The silences are codified rhythmically. And what if they weren't? And you just take time, if you're very emotioned by something, to stay a little longer suspended on the rest. And if you're nervous, uncomfortable on stage, because it's not easy for the psyche to be exposing so intimately one's inner feelings, it's quasi-indecent. And then one feels compelled to just go on. So not overindulge, not uncomfortably connect, rather take the time to breathe, I would say physiologically. I know it takes time to play like that in front of an audience, because you have to accept being in this extraordinary situation, which you're most of the time not when you practice by yourself. Yeah, the pianist is a lonely journey in life, because you search within yourself, you search through the instrument that is not always connected to you in terms of following you everywhere, like a violin or a flute. And then you have to adjust and try to play on a given concert, on a given piano, something subtly soft. And then on another piano it will come out differently, even if you put the same intensity. Very difficult to manage on stage for an unexperienced student, because inevitably there is a sort of dephasing between your inner thought of how you wanted to project the sound and what really comes out. And the bothering is bigger than the acceptance. And when you accept, like a chameleon, to blend in the jungle, then the predators don't see you. They think you're a flower when you might be a frog. So I would say, feel like as if you're home. No. Feel like you're right to be in this exceptional situation. You don't stick as a inappropriate person in an inappropriate room. You're part of them, and you have the composer's music with you, in you, that has to come out of you. Ephemerally we played every time, accepting the human condition of imperfection while practicing towards it, in a repetitive or exercised way. And at the moment of delivery, expect to do something completely different from what you planned in the practice room, because the circumstances bring you to sound differently, more or less predictably, and the least predictable, the more you have to act like you deal with the unexpected. As if you intended this accent, then you have to justify it by another arrival point accent. I mean, these things are easy to say, and in a way they're not really helpful, because it's only doing it, trying it, performing it, betraying yourself a little bit, but holding yourself through the piece with the pulse and the tempo and the breathing and the phrasing and the sense of direction and meaning of the line for that sense of direction, as well as quality of sound that you want to create as a blossoming flower, if it were to be, in a singing piano extraction, imitation. Of course, it depends on the piano. Thank you.